House Committee on Labor will come to order. Will the clerk please take the roll?
Chair Hadsma.
Here.
Representatives Menser.
Here.
Colazar.
Here.
O'Neill.
Present.
Andrews.
Here.
Churches.
Present.
Wagella.
Here.
Wozniak.
Here.
Mueller.
Here.
Kuntz.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
I have a motion to adopt the minutes of the September 28, 2023 meeting. Representative Wagella makes that motion. The minutes are adopted. We're here this morning to receive testimony on House Bills 4932 and 4962 from Representatives Skaggs and Scott. Before we hear testimony, I'd like to have a motion to adopt the most recent version of House Bill 4932. Vice Chair Menser makes that motion to adopt the H1 substitute to House Bill 4932. Will the clerk please take the roll?
On the motion to adopt the substitute, Chair Hadsma.
Yes.
Representatives Menser.
Yes.
Colazar.
Yes.
O'Neill.
Yes.
Andrews.
Yes.
Churches.
Yes.
Wagella.
Yes.
Wozniak.
Yes.
Mueller.
Pass.
Kuntz.
Pass. I've not had time to review it.
Mr. Chair, you have 8 yeas, 0 nays, and 2 pass. The substitute is adopted.
Thank you. I now welcome Representative Skaggs at this point to introduce his bill. I understand Representative Scott is in another hearing, but will be along later to give testimony in relation to her bill. Representative Skaggs.
Good morning, Chair Hadsma, members of the Labor Committee. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning to testify on these important bills. We're all here for very specific reasons, but I think one of the core reasons that we are here is to protect those that can't protect themselves. And that's what these bills are about, protecting children from exploitation. I'm saddened to report that Michigan has a serious problem with its child labor laws. I want to start with 2 examples where inadequate penalties and enforcement difficulties when it comes to our child labor laws. In November 2019, a 17-year-old was illegally working at a meat processing plant in Ionia when his arm was caught in a meat grinder and was torn off and shredded. He lost an entire arm for the rest of his life. The company that was hiring him did not have the necessary work permits to have a child working at the facility. And the child was working in what is defined as dangerous conditions, obviously. This case was recently settled by the Attorney General after the owner of the plant pled guilty to employing a minor in dangerous circumstances. His fine, $1,143. $1,143 for a life-altering lost arm. It is time for us to change this. After the settlement, Attorney General Nessel called on us in the legislature to, quote, strengthen these protections as well as the consequences for violations. Second example, earlier this year in an expose by Hannah Dreier at the New York Times, she uncovered several instances of children being subjected to exploitation and unsafe working conditions, including at 3 factories in my district. These kids were working on hazardous assembly lines with fast-moving pulleys and gears that had a history of tearing off fingers and even ripping open scalps. While we await final judgment in these cases from the federal government, we know under state law the maximum fine for a company involved in this exploitation of our children is $500 and a misdemeanor. Now, while our Youth Employment Standards Act, Michigan's child labor law, is very strong, it has several significant flaws that are harming Michigan children and teenagers. Number one, the current penalties and fines are simply not enough to deter bad actors and unethical companies from exploiting our children and their labor. As I said, the maximum fine is $500. That was instituted in 1981. Look around the room. There's only a couple of us who can remember 1981. But let's just stipulate that that was a long time ago. Number two, until this year, the only way to learn of potential violations was through a whistleblower report on the suspected business to the authorities. Thanks to Representative Will Snyder and those of you who voted on the budget, we now finally have 2 labor investigators that are focused on investigations and enforcement of our child labor laws. The third problem that we have is that the laws inadvertently are both protecting the child and harming the child. They're protecting the child from the immediate instance of exploitation and danger, but they are inadvertently harming the child because the fines go into the general fund. Most of the children that are in these dangerous conditions are there because their families are experiencing great poverty. And if, on the odd chance, a labor violation is enforced, these children are often just compelled to go to another exploitative owner. And this is another problem that my bill helps to fix. My bill increases the penalties for violations of the Youth Employment Standards Act and allows for victim compensation. This bill would increase financial penalties from 5 to 10 times what they currently are so that we can deter bad actors. Under the bill, the first offense would be punishable by a $5,000 fine, the second offense by a $25,000 fine, and subsequent offenses by a $50,000 fine. Now, the department has the authority to go under those levels. The department is not interested in causing great financial damage to a mom and pop ice cream shop that just happens to have accidentally, inadvertently, unknowingly violated the law by having a teenage scooper on July 4th. But for the bad actors, especially the bad actors that are caught multiple times, we need to have strong penalties. Finally, the bill mirrors federal law by providing specific enhanced penalties on employers that violate the law if the misconduct results in death or great bodily harm, like losing an arm. Under the H-1 substitute on our bill, the fine would be required to be at least $50,000 and the employer could face felony charges. It's important for me to note that we should not construe these bills as discouraging teenagers from working. Having a job at a young age can teach important lifelong lessons and help support families. But unethical individuals and unscrupulous companies that break the law and exploit our kids for higher profits have to be held accountable. Children have the right to be safe, and we need to protect them. They have the right to focus on their education and their learning years. Teenagers shouldn't be working on egg farms 12 hours a day. They shouldn't be working the night shift on dangerous assembly lines. And they shouldn't be working under dangerous and hazardous conditions. I hope that these bills will see widespread bipartisan support because our children are not commodities to be exploited. It's corny, but they're our future. They're our own kids. and it is our duty to protect them from exploitation. That's exactly what these bills do. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome, and thank you, Representative Skaggs. Questions? Representative Wozniak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your testimony, Rep. Skaggs. In the little flyer that you put out, I think it's from you, it says several states are pushing to loosen child labor restrictions. Would you know any reason for that?
I think the overall reason is that, as we know, we are experiencing some labor shortages given the facts of some difficulties in labor, in the size of the labor force, and difficulties coming out of COVID. And there's a sense that there is an untapped labor pool in our children. But I simply believe that this is the wrong solution. We have other solutions available to us other than loosening child labor laws. My bill does very little to the existing law. It does constrain the director to allow deviations in certain circumstances, which the department has informed me they don't have any memory of doing. Our child labor laws here in Michigan are strong. It is the enforcement and the deterrence capability of them that is the problem.
And I agree with you on that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Representative Coons.
Sorry, I was deferring to you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming today, Representative. Two questions, if I may, Mr. Chairman. How did we arrive at the penalty amounts? And I'll follow right up with my second one. Maybe you can do them both. Can we compare injury rates with states that have higher amounts? Will this solve the problem? Do you see my question? I'm trying to see if a higher penalty amount, can we compare that to other states that have it in place now?
The penalty amounts, welcome, Representative Scott, it's good to see you. The penalty amounts were derived by looking predominantly at the federal levels, and just a common sense approach to what sorts of penalties could deter bad action. As far as a heightened comparison between states on whether high penalties lead to better enforcement, it's difficult to tell. How would we know what the level of exploitation out there is when we don't have until, what's today, the 12th? We don't have until 11 days ago even a job posting to have investigators on it. We've been working just with whistleblowers. So we are simply using common sense here, that if you have investigators and if you have deterring penalties, that you will be capable of modifying behavior.
Representative Wagella.
First off, thank you both for this legislation. I think this is exactly the role that our government should be playing, protecting our most vulnerable populations from exploitation. I think just want to reference in terms of this conversation around penalties. I don't know if you can put a price on a child losing their arm, and certainly the motivations for companies that are for profit using child labor is to enhance their profits because you can pay children less to do certain works, and they're doing it out of necessity. So $1,143, I think, is what you referenced was the fine. That's simply unacceptable, and I think this will deter employers from doing this because it will hurt their profits. It won't be economically advantageous for them to employ children, as disgusting as those words were to say out of my mouth, that we even have to have that conversation. But the one thing I do want to just ask, and this is just in general policy I think we do in Lansing, any consideration for tying the fines to the consumer price index or inflation so that, in 20, 30 years, these fines aren't lower than they should be. It's just something I was thinking about.
Do you want to comment at all? Okay. Yes, I think we can say that the vast majority of businesses are acting in a manner in which they are in compliance with our child labor laws. Those businesses shouldn't have to compete with businesses that are taking shortcuts by exploiting children. To the second question, I am certainly open to any sorts of amendments that would make sure that we, what we are partly doing here is updating these levels because we're going back 42 years to the last time that they were set. So I would be favorable to any amendment that came forward.
I would be as well.
Representative Andrews.
Thank you, Chair. I have a really niche question, I think. So I grew up with family businesses, and, as a kid with parents who owned a business, I often found myself working for them on various days. And I noticed that with the hours worked requirement, I just want to make sure that in the case of like a family-owned restaurant, there isn't a possible issue where like a 14-year-old might be working at the restaurant and it's dinner service or something, and it's after 9 o'clock, and then they're getting dinged for child labor, but it's not really the same thing. Like I said, it's a really corner case thing, but I just want to make sure that a family-owned restaurant isn't going to suddenly find themselves with like a huge fine because their 14-year-old son or daughter was waiting tables at 9:30 or something.
Right. So that was my ice cream scooper on July 4th thought, and I would defer to the departments to give to answer your niche question about this. Although there are certainly allowances for family labor.
Yeah.
But this department, in its workings with people who are in violations with the law, has assured me that their first goal here is education of the business. So if there is a minor problem that is reported to them or which they may find with the new investigators, their goal is to educate that business to not be in violation of the law. I think that you are only going to see these more substantial fines in cases where it's clearly a bad actor, and especially if one who, and that is why the fees increase significantly for second and third violations, because they will have learned about all the child labor laws and would clearly and knowingly be in violation if they continue to flaunt them.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Skaggs. Representative Scott, in relation to House Bill 4962, what might you offer?
Okay, well, good morning, Chair.
Good morning.
And committee, thank you so much for allowing us to speak today on House Bill 4962. So this bill really is about accountability, right? We're holding bad actors who violate the Youth Employment Standards Act to the fire in order to protect our children from exploitative working conditions and workplaces. My bill, or our bill, significantly increases both the administration and criminal penalties. Repeat offenders may pay more fines and do more time if they violate the Youth Employment Standards Act. From the headlines in recent news, we know that young people are exploited in the workplace. They can end up seriously hurt, like the 17-year-old boy who lost his hand, which is just totally unacceptable, while working in a meat processing plant in Ionia. And unfortunately, some youth have even lost their lives due to working in hazardous and or unsafe workplaces, sometimes performing jobs and limited training using heavy machinery and equipment. Lastly, and importantly, the legislation shifts accountability for youth employment from schools to the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, giving LEO multiple tools to both monitor and better crack down with real consequences on employers who violate the youth employment standards. This bill will allow Leo to receive judgment and seek relief for violations, and the Attorney General, General Dana Nessel, will also have the power to pursue civil action to collect on the unpaid fines. This legislation says to employers who hire minors that we're serious about protecting our youth and their physical, mental, and financial well-being. The work experiences of young people should be positive, safe, and when possible, a teachable experience. Oftentimes, those first few jobs help form a strong work ethic and build a sense of pride from earning a decent wage and being able to contribute something for a larger purpose. The youth of our state deserve to be put first, and this legislation provides them the protection needed to keep them safe while working. So I really urge you to really care about our youth, care about them working in environments that are safe. I think it's our responsibility as legislators to make sure that they're protected. So I want to thank you for supporting this bill, 4962, and for standing up for our youth with this smart, tougher legislation to better enforce the youth employment standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Scott. Questions of Representative Scott? Thank you, Representative Scott. Thank you, Representative Skaggs. We'll now hear from the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, specifically from Director Sean Egan and Jay Shauna Hicks from the department.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Hatsma and members of the committee for inviting us to speak today. My name is Jay Shauna Hicks, and I am Leo's Legislative Affairs Deputy Director. And with me today is Sean Egan, who is our Deputy Director of our Labor Division, which includes overseeing our Wage and Hour Division, who is responsible for administering and enforcing our Youth Employment Standards Act, which we call YESA for short. Today we're gonna give you like a high-level overview of YESA, really kind of hone in on the enforcement side, and also kind of highlight some of the challenges we have with enforcing YESA, which these bills help address. So we certainly appreciate Representative Skaggs and Representative Scott for introducing this legislation. And lastly, we'd also like to highlight another avenue we'd like to pursue related to work permits that will really help us protect our working youth. So I'll kick it over to Sean.
Thank you, Jay Shauna. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you again and talk about another very important issue for all of us here in Michigan. I won't go through my title and everything because Jay Shauna covered that for me, and I appreciate that. According to NIOSH, which is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, it's a group formed by the CDC, works with OSHA, MIOSHA, and does a lot of health and safety stuff. They estimate that about 160,000 young workers suffer an occupational injury each year, and at least a third or more are severe enough that warrant emergency room treatment. And every state has adopted some form of youth employment standards, and Michigan is also one of 36 states that require work permits. And it's important to note that work permits are not required under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which set the foundation for youth employment. States have adopted these laws to address specific issues and to make sure that coverage goes beyond those that are covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. I know it's hard for us to believe, but there are actually employers that may not be subject to the jurisdiction of the U.S. Department of Labor because they're too small or don't engage in certain industries. The Fair Labor Standards Act sets the floor for youth employment. So when we talk about in our statute and in our rules what are identified as hazardous occupations, that's been established by the U.S. Department of Labor. So we cannot go beyond what they have set. You can think of youth employment standards being broken into largely two groups. So it's 14-15, think of that, and then 16-17. Standards are tighter for 14 and 15-year-olds on hours of work and places that they can be. They're a little looser for 16 and 17-year-olds, but in either case, both laws, federal and state, set 14 as the minimum age to work. As we saw in the expose from the New York Times, the employer in question had people believed to be as young as 12, clearly a violation of the act, as Representative Skaggs pointed out. There are some exceptions for certain types of occupations. I think many of us, if you're old enough, they don't do it anymore, you might have delivered newspapers. That is something that young workers can do. And there are other things there. They set certain hours of work, number of hours worked, breaks and rest periods, and then certain occupations are just off the table, and many of those you can think of include power-driven equipment. So certainly you think big equipment, but also saws, cutters, meat slicers, things that could severely injure someone. And I think we always have to keep in mind, while we treat our young people as adults, they are young people, and their brains are still developing, and their awareness is not as thorough as sometimes it could be, and that's another reason they have to be supervised by an adult. As Representative Skaggs said, education outreach is at the heart of everything we do in the Department of Labor, and wage and hour is no different. Youth employment certainly is no different. We have an internal target to reach at least 4,000 participants every year, and we exceed that every year on various issues that we do. We do multiple outreach and engagement with the U.S. Department of Labor on youth employment. We are connected to large employers that typically hire youth workers. You can think fast food restaurants. We have a number of great relationships where we help, and we make that a point to make sure that we're connected out there and educating before we regulate. With that, we still receive about 250 to 300 youth employment complaints annually, and as Representative Skaggs said, that's the only way we find out if there's a problem. We do try to proactively investigate the best that we can, but there's an issue with that I'm going to share with you in just a moment. We process also 4,000 to 6,000 deviation requests in any given year. So any employer can ask the department for a deviation from the youth employment standards, not beyond federal law, of course, but they can, and it's typically things like a 14-year-old can only work till 7 p.m., they want them to stay till 7:30. And we'll approve that type of deviation as long as it's in the best interest of the minor. And we do that often. We also process permits for young actors. They have to get permits under law to do acting work in our state. So we do that kind of stuff quite often. We do it well. We also open investigations upon referral, so we have a great referral network with MIOSHA. Certainly if they're investigating a workplace injury and they believe it's a young worker, they will refer that to us. If they are investigating any workplace and they see someone that clearly looks like they are too young to be in that particular workplace, they'll contact us and we'll follow up. And we'll do media referrals. Like anytime we learn that there might be a youth employment issue, we will show up there. The other major challenge that we're talking with Representative Skaggs about and others is our work permit process here in Michigan. Believe it or not, even though there are roughly 500,000 students enrolled in 9th through 12th grade, roughly in that working age population for minors, we have no idea where they are, how many are employed, what types of industries they're in, or any other information about where these young workers are going. So when we first heard from representatives about the New York Times expose and they kind of asked that question, what's going on with kids in Michigan? The answer is we don't know. We find out when it becomes a problem, and we don't like that. So we've looked to several other states that have changed the permitting process. Ours currently in Michigan, work permits are issued by the school district where the child lives. The only requirement is that the employer keep the work permit on record, so when we do an investigation, we can see that one exists. But we never see that again. So many states have switched the process to actually have work permits issued by their Department of Labor or whatever department oversees youth employment, and we do want to move in that direction. We've talked with MDE about it on work permits on several issues, and they're good with the concept, so there's some work to do there. But under our current law, as was said, there really are no penalties. So as a division that's trying to enforce this act, our only sort of stick is if you don't comply, we're going to refer this over to a local prosecutor who may or may not see this as an issue and may or may not take up this issue, or refer it over to our AGs. And as we know, prosecutors, attorney generals are dealing with a lot of different crimes. And sometimes a youth employment violation might not rise high on that list. And the only additional penalties under the law are a little bit illogical at this point in time. You can have an additional penalty if a minor is working under 12A, which is basically they're doing cash transactions after sunset. That's a little peculiar now, without supervision. They can do it as long as there's supervision. Or what is logical, they're working in a child abusive industry, so think adult entertainment or things where we know kids should not be. You can have an additional penalty. So for the example cited by Representative Skaggs, our hands are pretty much tied on what we can get an employer to do, and our goal is compliance. We don't want to fine anybody. We just want you to do what you're supposed to do. But if you find people that just are not going to do that, or they're just violating the law intentionally or maybe even willfully, or they need a little more stick to go along with our education and outreach, we need the tools to make sure that we can do that. And we believe the additional civil fine procedure within the division enhances our ability to get that kind of compliance. We see it in a lot of regulatory statutes, and it does make sense. I will say we looked around at a lot of other states, and at least in the civil fine area, it's pretty much in line with what we see in several other states. There are some lower, there are some higher, but that's pretty much in line with what we see from those regulatory agencies. And any proposed fines would include the seriousness of the issue, the size of the employer, good faith efforts at compliance, do they have a history of violations, and other reasonable mechanisms to be sure that we're fair, because as I said, we don't want the money, we want the kids safe. Right? The goal is to make sure that the kid is safe in any place that they're working. So we'd make sure we do that in any determination subject to appeal. So if it seems unreasonable, any employer could appeal that. So with that, I'll stop talking, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have for me.
Are there any questions of Ms. Hicks or Mr. Egan? Representative Wozniak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In your day-to-day work and looking at all the children that are at work in the state, do you see any experiences of trafficking in the labor market for those young people?
We're not a criminal enforcement agency.
Right.
We refer something like that over to the Attorney Generals. I think that I can't answer the question. I mean, I don't want to wax poetic on the question, so I'll just kind of say no, we wouldn't necessarily see that. We do have requirements for human trafficking postings, but we don't have anything to do with human trafficking enforcement.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Representative Kuntz.
Thank you for coming today. You've looked at other states and you've compared their penalties. Tell me about penalties versus injury rates.
Yeah, I think the challenge for us right now, having heard you ask that question,
Exactly.
is I don't know that we would know. So I don't know that we would know or be able to answer that question. I think that because it's a reactive position that we're in, especially with the work permits, we don't necessarily know where kids are working. We do know that injuries are not always reported. They may handle it themselves, so I don't know that we would know. So we could definitely try to look at the data, but I don't know if we could segregate it enough to say young workers don't get hurt as much because it gets amalgamated.
My question is, do higher fines
Lead to lower injuries, yeah. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. So if I may, Mr. Chair, my question is not just the state of Michigan. Well, I think we know our injury rates. My question is, compare this to other states with higher penalty rates.
Yeah,
that
I
is
understand.
my question. Okay.
Yeah, I understand. I don't know that we could do that. We could try to research that for you and get back to you to see if we can draw the correlation.
Thank you.
Representative Wagella.
So just a question on procedure with work permits. You mentioned, work permits were approved, given by the school district. Is that what you said? What happens for children not in public schools? I just curious.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the school district under the law is still obligated to issue that permit for the student, even if they're not a student, if they live inside that district. So we often have challenges for homeschool students, making sure that they get those permits. We also hear from employers during the summer when school is out of being able to get work permits quickly. So there's a few challenges in there. Yeah.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to that question, so what other alternatives have the department thought about that would remedy that issue?
So what we've seen in a few states that we like, New Jersey and both Louisiana, in fact, have reversed the permitting process. So the young worker requests the permit from the Department of Labor or any department that oversees them. It just reverses the flow. So they come into us, goes to the employer, parents definitely sign off, gets to the school. So that it's quicker, more efficient. And what we do like about those systems is the young worker only needs to register once. And they'll stay in the system until they're an adult, and as they change employment, it's just a click, 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 click. So we like it.
So I assume that that's something we're going to undertake.
Well, that'll be up to all of you, but we're certainly having discussions and providing information to the best of our ability to Representative Skaggs and anybody that's interested in having that discussion.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. Representative Churches.
Sorry, I just kind of, that made me think what Rep. O'Neill had mentioned is, so I just want to make sure that all people have access. So is there like a suggestion that you have to make sure that people are educated on how to get a work permit? Because I just want to make sure that we as reps are able to communicate to our constituency the easiest, most effective way for them to do. I mean,
We have those tools available. We'd be happy to coordinate with any of you in your districts, with the school districts, with your constituents on what work permits are, or how you get those.
Okay.
We do coordinate with school districts the best that we can. I think it's rough, right? We have a lot of schools, so that means a lot of issuing officers and a lot of varying geographies, and so it makes it a little bit challenging. But we'd be happy to get we work our tails off to make sure we're educating everybody because it's complex and it's important.
And I appreciate that. I just want to make sure that my constituent service department has like the tools it needs. So
Absolutely.
Thank you.
We'll do.
Thank you. Mr. Egan and Ms. Hicks.
Thank you.
You're welcome. We're now here from Rick Anksman, a teacher from Grand Rapids Union High School.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you, committee, for having me.
Good morning.
I work at Grand Rapids Public Schools, Union High School. A few of our scholars were mentioned in the New York Times article. And I'm here to talk about how we can protect the children. There's a lot of good issues that were brought up today. On the work permits, for example, several of our kids will get a work permit from our school. They'll bring it to the employer fills it out, and then it's brought back to the school, and then we sign off on to make sure they are eligible during the hours that they're going to work on it. Many of our children work, and it's not just from the immigrant workers that the article portrayed. I've been coaching high school athletics for 26 years. I faced many problems with athletes not being able to work, students having to work after jobs. And defining those jobs sometimes is a little bit different, as Andrews mentioned about working in a family business. Well, one thing that we have to notice in our district is that some of our children are acting as parents while their children are working multiple jobs. So we're asking them to come to school to do athletics, then to go home and maybe have to take care of their children while their mom works, go to bed late, or sometimes their mom's working third shift. They have to get up early in the morning, get their kids or their siblings on buses and get them to school. And it just makes it very difficult to have them learn when they have to worry about working and taking care of their family. And that's why many of our children work. Even the immigrant children that were referenced in the article, they're working not just to provide for themselves, but also to provide for their family in other countries. We have over 70 languages spoken in our district, 42 countries represented, and most of those other countries, when children come from those places or other adults come, they're expected to help their families out financially in any ways they can. And I think the more protections and the more penalties for this illegal type work is going to benefit our scholars in the long run. It's very difficult from when I grew up. I graduated in the 80s from Union High School as well. Middle class family, both parents work, so I could do athletics, I could work part-time on it. But the new reality, especially in our city, where skyrocketing rents have gone up to over $1,500 a month, making housing affordable, non-affordable, people having to really struggle to get jobs and make the requirements, working is the new norm. And I think that the fact that some of these factories kind of skirt the issue. Right after the article came out, a lot of people were calling for teachers. Why didn't you report this? Why didn't you tell people that these kids were working? Well, personally, I work from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. I work my regular shift during the day, and then I also do a credit recovery program for scholars who have fallen behind. Now, those kids that are falling behind on this are now in school from 2:30 to 6:30 in the afternoons. And they're also expected to work sometimes and take care of their family. It's a very, very difficult job and a different world for these young kids coming up than I've ever had to experience. And I've seen this many, many times over many, many years. And just to say that, you know, as a mandatory reporter, as public school teachers are, dealing with 200 children every single day of my own children, plus my own 4 daughters at my house that are also of working age, it's hard to know exactly when or what type of job they're working in, what other challenges they're having. I deal mostly with freshmen, but also all classes, and their lives are difficult with social media, with jobs, with everything else that encompasses it. And to be taken advantage of, to say you must work this late shift unannounced, it's not the teacher's responsibility to enforce rules that these companies have. And fines of $500 to me seems archaic. The current unit that our studies are watching, and I'd like to say a shout out to Union High School because I know our youth in government are very interested in this and watching this on government TV right now. They have a lot of responsibilities to keep working, and this is what they want to do, to protect their families, to have a normal, educational, happy life. And any changes that can be made or any other opportunities that kids could be afforded, that's what we in education would like to see our successful children and scholars become, because that is the most important thing for Michigan's future going forward, how we handle this child labor, how we handle our children's educational requirements, and just making them happy and healthy.
Representative Wagella.
Mike doesn't want to cooperate today. Thank you for being here. I was an educator for 7.5 years, and the children you're talking about are the children I taught. I taught for 5 years in Phoenix in a migrant immigrant community. I taught in Michigan in Dearborn Public Schools, a lot of immigrants in that community as well. And I think what's been described in the article and what you're describing is really important to contextualize, is that, you know, we essentially have a modern day how the other half lives situation going on. And for people who aren't sure what I'm referencing, it's Jacob Riis's book on the tenements in New York City in the early 1900s. We need to do better as a society to protect each other, to protect our kids, and I think this legislation is a step in the right direction. And I think some of the issues you're describing are greater and societal about how working class people are just being exploited in our system, and that affects our children. And I appreciate the work that you do, and being here and your students watching or students watching across the state, it's really important. So just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Angstman, thank you for taking the time to come down from Grand Rapids to testify. We appreciate your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Not wishing to speak, but in support of 4932 are David Randalls from Oakland Schools, Eleanor Jordan from the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, and Tammy Danzer from the Michigan Education Association. Not wishing to speak, but opposing 4932 and 4962 is Dawn Crandall from the Home Builders Association of Michigan. Not wishing to speak, but supportive of 4932 and 4962 are Yusuf Rabi from the Michigan Nurses Association, Ashley Steffen from the Michigan Department of Attorney General, Ryan Seabolt from the Michigan AFL-CIO, Robert George from the Michigan Laborers District Council, Ann Kunin from the Michigan League for Public Policy Kids Count, Mitch Albers from the Michigan Association for Justice, and Janelle Mansfield from AFT Michigan. There being no further business before this committee, the House Committee on Labor is adjourned.